Hi, everyone. Welcome to day two of, let me go back. Welcome to day two of expanding into international Amazon marketplaces, EU to EU versus EU to US. Today, we will be focusing on the European Union to the United States, and we have Rachel Greer and Cynthia Stein on today to present. Jeff Cohen, I know, was supposed to be able to present today, but he is still not well. So, wish him the best. To start, real quick, talk about Seller Labs real fast with you guys. Feedback Genius is one of our premier software applications. We use it. We sell it to Amazon third-party merchants, and they use it to automate messages and grow, increase their product reviews as well as their seller feedback. It's available in 8 Amazon marketplaces, and it has a whole variety of features to keep you up to date with what's going on with your account. Snackshot is our other software application that we have that helps Amazon sellers increase conversions and generate product reviews, as well as launching products and helping you boost sales on your current products. And Scope is our soon-to-be released product research tool. And with Scope, you can understand the fees associated with selling and sourcing a new product, understand what keywords are helping you get ranked or get ranked better with improved keywords, and understand how much your competition's selling. So Rachel, if you're not familiar with Rachel, she has more than 7 years of experience working with Amazon. And at Amazon, she managed audits. She did product testing, packaging, and inspections, as well as working with the Amazon Basics program. And last year, she founded Cascadia Seller Solutions, and her team consults small to medium-sized enterprises who need help protecting and building their brand on Amazon. And Cynthia Stein is an entrepreneur with 25 plus years of experience selling and consulting companies. And she helps a lot of sellers and companies survive crisis situations. She's also the author of the best-selling book, Suspension Prevention, and she blogs about all things Amazon on online sales step by step. And without further ado, we'll let Cynthia take it away.
Hi. My portion of this is I talk about suspensions because our clients, they come to us because they've been suspended and they need help getting back on the platform. And so I wanted to talk a lot about what's happening in the U.S. As well as the U.K. and Europe in terms of suspensions, because what happens in the U.S. is going to be happening in Europe probably in about I don't know, a year, 18 months. So it's going to all be happening over there if it's not happening there yet. And also, if you're looking to sell into the U.S. marketplace, you need to understand that they have really tightened down on the algorithm for suspending sellers. So what happened, it started last spring. That's when it was most visible to most people. They had a major rehaul on the algorithm. And what they did was they said, look, we want to clean up the platform and get rid of these sort of shoddy products, right? People were sending in products that were maybe dirty or dusty or creased, or the corners were mashed, or they were less than perfect, and they were selling them as new. And so Amazon said, like, we don't want to do that anymore. And so they really tweaked the algorithm for what we call product quality. And they didn't tell anyone outside of Amazon that they were doing this, right? And they just, all of a sudden, people who've been selling for years suddenly got suspended, and they were all shocked because they were used to keeping an eye on their metrics on the dashboard, and there was nothing there to tell them that there was something wrong. And I say here, no humans involved, because again, it is an algorithm. So I like the image of a robot because it's more accessible. Like, it's hard to visualize an algorithm, but I can visualize a robot, right? But basically, it is highly automated, and so it's triggered by all kinds of things, which of course they don't tell us because this is the secret sauce, right? This is the black box. But what we've been able to observe from the outside is that their keywords are triggered in customer messages, buyer returns, and negative feedback. So if you're selling a product on Amazon.com and your buyer returns it, depending on the reason they give for returning it, it may count against you as what we call a negative return. So a normal return is just like, oh, it didn't fit, it wasn't the right size. But a negative return is for one of these product quality reasons, which I'm going to get into in a minute. But even if they send you an email and ask you a question with a trigger word, or they leave you negative feedback and it has one of the trigger words in it, all of these can trigger a suspension of either your listing or your account. So, and the thing is, nobody's going to actually look at your case until after you're suspended and you've sent in your appeal. So while there is a human that will send you the initial email and paste in some ASINs that are indicative of the problem, they're not analyzing your account. No one is sitting there saying, let's see what's happening with Cynthia Stein today. Why is she getting these? What's going on here? There's no one that does that until after you turn in your appeal, and then they look at it. So there's no humans involved until then. There's no metrics that they give us. So in other words, there's no dashboard for product quality issues. And while this is not your fault, you are responsible nonetheless as a seller. So this is something you need to know going into the U.S. marketplace, is that it is, they're very tough on product quality issues, and on making sure your product is as perfect as possible. And they're not going to give you any help or instructions about this. This is just something that they expect you to do as a seller, and it is part of your incredibly long contract that you sign with them, that you are responsible for product quality. It's just not really well defined. So that's why a lot of people were caught by surprise last spring. And then ever since then, there have been fairly regular tweaks to this algorithm. And so what we see in our office is that there'll be a wave of sellers that come in all for the same reason. And we'll be like, oh, algorithm tweak. So they are constantly upgrading their algorithm. And like I said, what we see here in the U.S. Does get translated also over to the European platform. It does tend to be a little bit slower. So, but it's coming, which is why, we encourage our sellers, no matter what platform they're on, to adopt best practices. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here's some of the reasons that we see that expanding sellers are having trouble when they move into the U.S. marketplace. For one thing, the shipping requirements are really stringent here in the U.S. And so folks who are used to selling in their own country and how long it takes the mail to get from one place to another, or how they do things, will find that it'll be different in the U.S. Basically, Amazon.com expects its sellers to be as efficient at shipping as they are. So if you're not doing FBA, if you're doing a merchant fulfilled deal, they expect you to get your products out to the clients or to the buyers really fast, basically the same day. And a lot of my clients find that they have difficulty keeping up with Amazon's shipping requirements, also for tracking data, and there's just a lot of places where you can make mistakes, and if you do make mistakes, that will come down on you. So like the valid tracking rate, several of my clients have had trouble with that because they're either not uploading the tracking data in a timely way, they're updating it too early, or they're making mistakes when they're updating it. And so they start to get a lot of errors and their metrics go down. And it's not that they're not getting the product out to buyers, they are, but they're not, crossing all their T's and dotting all their I's. So that's one area where sellers have issues. And I really encourage sellers coming into this marketplace to consider FBA, because this is one headache you really don't want to take on yourself unless, again, you already have operations in the U.S. that can do this for you. Products that are forbidden in the new market. So again, you just need to be aware that there are things that we don't allow to be sold here that maybe are okay back home. And this is something that sellers make going cross-platform anytime. They just don't understand their new marketplace. So when you log into Seller Central in the U.S., the first thing you should be doing is reading um, all about restricted products and reading all the updates on your category. For example, if you sell food, food last year declared that you could no longer do multi-packs, right? And there's certain bundles they don't allow. And if you sell a commodity food product, it now has to be private label. These are all new changes within the last year in the U.S. So this will take some reading and really digging into whatever category you're selling in to understand what's going on. And again, it doesn't mean it won't be the same probably as it is over there. What constitutes inauthentic? Okay, this has been really big in the U.S. and I've seen some of it outside of the U.S., but big in the U.S. Inauthentic is Amazon's way of making sure that everything that's sold on the platform is authentic. It's coming from a legitimate source. And so there are some sellers here who have been buying from the gray market to sell on Amazon. And while it's not illegal to buy from the gray market, the problem with gray market goods is we don't know exactly where they come from, and they might be stolen or they might be counterfeit. And so Amazon is basically, every time there's an inauthentic complaint, they are investigating. They'll shut down your listing. They may shut down your account if you have too many of these. And you have to provide invoices that prove that you bought from a legitimate source, which most of my clients can't do, okay? Because they bought from a guy who knows a guy, maybe, but they didn't buy from somebody who was an official authorized reseller of those goods. So just be aware of that as you move into the U.S., that they're really cracking down on inauthentic goods. And you will, at some point, no doubt, need to provide proof that you bought from a legitimate source. There's also been a lot of copyright, trademark infringement issues. Accounts getting shut down because the sellers are violating trademark. So again, just be aware of that. And if you're a private label seller that's moving into the U.S., you want to make sure that your trademark is protected in the U.S. and that you register with Amazon.com in the U.S. so that you can protect your listings on Amazon. And then different standards of customer service. So a lot of our sellers are learning the hard way that they have to have customer service operations that are totally buttoned up. And for the merchant fulfilled seller, this is tricky sometimes. And again, if you're coming into this market from a different country, maybe you don't speak English very well, or your customer support people don't, you're going to need to have scripts, and you're going to need to have them in English, and you're going to need to make sure that the buyers are happy with their answers. And basically one of the, another reason why people might get suspended moving into the U.S. is they don't understand the buyer. So again, this is something where I would really encourage people to spend time understanding the American buyer if you're going to come into the U.S. or Canada or Mexico, because what they expect and how, may be different than what they expect in your country. I know in our country, they're very demanding, right? They want perfect everything. They've been spoiled by Amazon, and so they expect it from all of Amazon's sellers as well. Manipulation of the platform. Again, that's largely where I see that is with product review programs. So a seller comes to the U.S., they want to promote their product, their private label product, and they run a campaign, a product review campaign and giveaway. But if you don't do it correctly, you can get shut down. And Amazon has been really strong about this. They've had 3 waves of lawsuits against product review companies. They are very adamant that people not try to game the system, manipulate the algorithm or anything like that. So this is an area where I would advise extreme caution and research, because again, they are more lax in the UK and in Europe with these programs. They haven't started cracking down on them over there the way they have here. And so there's still some practices in the product review companies over there that they can't do here. product quality, obviously, that's probably the number one reason why people get shut down. And largely, again, that's because they don't have the metrics. They don't know what's going on in their account, and so it catches them by surprise. Next slide. Okay, so what is product quality? Again, this is like one of the top reasons, or one of the top, yeah, the overall heading is product quality. And this is what you might see when a buyer returns a product. You might look at a report and this is what you see. Or maybe they'll send you an email and they'll say this in the email, or they'll leave you negative feedback and it will say it in there. And you're thinking, what are they talking about? All my product is new. Why are they saying it's used, sold as new? Well, again, that may be because your product is ugly. If it didn't get to them in really great shape, that's why they may be saying that. Not as described is usually a listing problem. Not always, but often it means that your product doesn't match the listing. And so you either need to fix the listing or you need to figure out why your product doesn't match the listing. Not as advertised means your product made a claim and it didn't fulfill it. So you think about like diet pills and things like that. And defective, obviously it didn't work somehow. Damaged, again, maybe it got beat up in shipping. Counterfeit, fake. This is not real counterfeit or fake. This is somebody says they think it's counterfeit or fake. Okay, Amazon has to investigate, but they understand that most of the time when the buyer says that, it's not actually counterfeit or fake. So they ask you to prove that it's legitimate. If they really thought it was counterfeit for sure, they wouldn't even give you a chance. So that's real counterfeit. You're just shut out and you're done. But if the buyer says it's fake or it's bogus or it's bootleg, they give you a chance to prove that yours is real and that the buyer is just cranky. The same with inauthentic. Okay, again, if somebody says, hey, you're not buying this from a legitimate source, you get a chance to prove that you're right. Next slide, please. Okay, and so this is me. Basically, I've written a book on this, Suspension Prevention, Get Reinstated and Protect Your Amazon Account. You can buy it at the UK as well as, of course, .com. And what we do is we help sellers who are suspended get back on the platform. We also help them with if they have just one listing that's suspended, or if they want someone to review their account and tell them if they're at risk. We do that. And basically, we're a consulting company, and I've been a business consultant for over 25 years. This company, I started selling on Amazon in 2010, so I'm also a seller. And 4 of my consultants are sellers. So we know exactly the world that you live in because we live in it too. So we help out with a wide range of business and best practices issues, as well as, of course, the most important one, getting clients reinstated. But once they're back on their feet, we help them establish best practices and try to avoid it ever happening again. Suspensions can be very expensive. They can take a long time to resolve. And it's just better to be preventative and be smart ahead of time. But anyway, that's how you can reach me, and I'll be back for the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was really educational. Right now, we're going to turn it over to Rachel Greer of Cascadia Seller Solutions. It's all yours, Rachel.
Great, thank you. Just to piggyback on some of the things that Cynthia said, prevention is so important. Doing it right from the beginning. I feel like doing things right the Amazon way, making sure that you prevent potential issues, is the same way as contacting a lawyer to make sure you set up your account the right way, or to contacting an accountant to make sure that you're structuring your business the right way. Talking to someone who actually understands Amazon is so important. I actually just found out this morning from a colleague that the team members in Seattle for seller performance and for product quality are not being replaced. If they leave, they're not being replaced. The headcount is moving to India. So I know many of you are familiar with the experience of calling customer service in India or calling seller support in India. I've seen multiple seller support threads on people saying, I'll just hang up if I get someone from India and just keep calling back until I get someone from the US. And there are seller support and customer service centers in the US, in North Dakota and West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee. But there are very, very few seller support or, seller performance or product quality employees anymore in the US. So you really don't have that luxury that you do with other areas to actually contact someone who really understands your business or how business works in general. There's most of the time the people who are doing this work are not experienced employees either. They're usually entry-level type employees. So really not getting into that queue and not getting people like that making decisions about your hard work and your business is the best possible way you can protect that business. Okay, so expanding internationally from EU to US. Next slide, please. So who are we, and why do I have the authority to speak on this subject? I worked at Amazon for over 7 years. My first role was as a law enforcement liaison for Amazon DE, and I actually got that job because of speaking German, although I haven't used my language skills in quite some time. And then moved to compliance, and there I managed recalls and product safety. I managed the Amazon Basics compliance team from 2012 to 2014, and I managed global imports. Responsible for the relaunch of Amazon's EU imports program in 2014 because I had been managing the US imports team for a year prior to that. So I'm very familiar with the requirements of US and EU and how those compare, so things that may work in the EU don't work in the US and vice versa. For our company, the whole consulting team at Cascadia are former Amazonians. Trade compliance, just to clarify what that means, trade compliance is all the logistics and customs pieces of the effort to bring something in. So anyone who's trying to bring in, say, a shipping container from China to the US and you're based out of the EU, the requirements are somewhat different for an NRI, a non-resident importer. You want to make sure that you have that buttoned up, that you're working with an experienced broker. What you want is someone who is not just an experienced broker, they're the ones who are handling all the paperwork, but someone who can help you as a new NRI into the US understand what pitfalls there are and what issues you'll encounter. Sometimes there are things that are required upon entry, sometimes there are not, but they may be required, so knowing what you need ahead of time is pretty valuable. And then the rest of the team was in various roles at Amazon. About half of us worked in Amazon Basics. So that's myself, Leo, Rain, and Belle. And Jennifer handled all imports into the US, including Amazon Basics. And Kelly is a former seller performance manager, and Emily used to handle product safety investigations. And prior to that, in the late 90s, was actually a customer service rep. Okay, next. So the 5 most common pitfalls that I see for anyone who's trying to go in from any other location into the US is really not understanding the legal obligations that being what's considered a manufacturer importer lays on you. And our focus as a company is really on brand owners or people who have exclusive relationships with brand owners, someone who is in some way liable or partially liable for the sale of the goods. So what we see as issues are not clearly spelling out your supplier agreement and purchase order, which I'll get into in a moment, not defining your brand identity and sourcing based on that identity. And by that I mean, do you want to focus on sustainability? Do you know what your customers want? And then source a factory that's qualified to do that. One example is there's plenty of factories who produce for the Africa and Middle East market. And those are not factories that you want to use to bring inventory into the US even, and certainly not into the EU. You want to look for who the factory's customers are. And there's a real fine line between having a factory who has great customers in the US and EU and a factory that you can work with. So as a smaller seller, a smaller player in this market, you still have to get the factory's attention. And so there's kind of a middle ground where you have a factory that's good enough to where they can produce for the US and EU markets, but aren't so big that you'll be ignored. Not evaluating the total profitability. It's really important to make sure that you're not just thinking about the base cost of the factory, that you're also thinking about all the other costs that go in. And having a factory that can't produce good products, so saving $1 or $2 on your original cost, may end up costing you with your returns or customer complaints about packaging. Not checking for regulatory compliance is a big one, and not checking for quality control and quality assurance really feeds back into a lot of what Cynthia was talking about. If you're reselling somebody else's stuff, you don't really have any control over their packaging and their quality. If you're importing your own items into the US, you are fully responsible. You are the one who should have done an inspection, who should have made sure that the packaging was sufficient so that it didn't arrive looking used to the customer or didn't arrive with smudges and scratches because the AQLs and the inspection weren't strict enough. So I'm going over in this section the various ways that you can prepare yourself to where you don't have these issues. Okay, next. So for supplier agreements, what we see is just not having them is a significant problem. So make sure you define all of your back and forth with the factory up front, and know that they're in the business of making money too. They end up making less than you do as someone who wholesales something. Their margins are slimmer than yours, typically between anywhere from 3 to 10% at most. So you can squeeze them a little bit, but understand if you squeeze them too much, then they're going to cheat on something because they have to. Otherwise, they won't be able to pay their own bills and their own employees. So make sure that you try to organize your supplier agreements to be fair to both parties, and really specify all of the requirements that you have. Specify your payment terms, specify how you're going to pay your POs, what kind of sample costs you have, what kind of tooling costs you have. Specify the invoice format. We've seen some limited acceptance of Chinese POs from product quality, but the main thing that we've seen is that most of the time, because Chinese companies are just making an Excel PO, that the invoice that you get is also Excel and not acceptable for Amazon. So define the invoice format and make sure they provide it to you in PDF format, and try to get ahead of that. The best defense, of course, is not getting on product quality's radar in the first place. And then, of course, keep it as short as possible and make sure that you're really clear about what you want, but 1 to 2 sentences about each is more than sufficient, since you're also trying to make it to where it's not super complicated. Business in China is a lot more about relationships, and if you're trusted, then you're trusted, period. All that the agreement helps you to do is to define the details. If you're not trusted, you're not trusted, period. The agreement won't help you. So just keep it short, the same way as it works in the US, where everything can be spelled out in the agreement and then move forward. It's a lot more relationship-based. So this is really just kind of a blueprint, and leave it at that. Okay, so purchase orders. In the purchase order, it's the next slide. In the next slide, so the purchase order, sorry. The standard purchase order consists of 30% down payment, 70% remaining. If you get a factory that says 50-50 or they want everything up front, either they don't trust you or they're in financial distress. Either way, probably not a factory you want to work with. You should define your product testing protocol. So what are you asking them to meet? You should define the inspection checklist, and you should define whether you need exclusivity from them and your packaging expectations in detail. That way they can accept or reject the PO based on what you've provided. I can't tell you how many times I've seen new PL sellers get into trouble by not defining everything up front, and then they import it and they realize that the product is either lighter weight than they expected or it's got crappier packaging, and now you have customer complaints. Now you have Amazon asking you, hey, what about this product? And we see a lot of issues with private label sellers shipping items in cheap poly bags that break in transit, or in really thin paperboard boxes instead of corrugate, to where by the time it arrives, it's damaged or it looks beat up. And all of this is about customer perception. And if the customer perceives that you're selling a knockoff Chinese item, whether it's your brand or not, they're going to assume it's a knockoff and claim inauthentic or not as described. So that's the real issue here, is that the packaging is a customer perception issue as well as protecting the product. But you will get used sold as new and listing takedowns if you do not have good enough packaging. This is a common issue with private label sellers. Okay, next. So your total landed cost consists of multiple inputs, and this is something that you should look into before doing any sort of importing into a new country. For working with Amazon in general, you want to calculate your duties first. Make sure you're not selling something that has anti-dumping duties where you're paying 100% or more duty on the product. Calculate your freight, not just your freight from China, but also your truck freight or your local freight. Sometimes local freight can be even more expensive than ocean freight from China. The global shipping markets are in a big downturn right now, so you can actually get something more cheaply from the port of Shenzhen in China to the port of LA than you can trucking it from LA to an East Coast Amazon FC. So it's a little bit crazy. Make sure you calculate out your freight first. And freight rates always change, so always a little bit different each day, but at least it'll give you a good idea of how much you're actually paying. Always structure in returns. You don't want to get more than 2% returns unless you're in accessories and clothing. If you have more than that, then you need to research and figure out what the problem is. Either your detail page isn't clear enough, people don't know what they're getting, or you've got some sort of packaging problem that's allowing things to arrive busted up or broken, or you've got an actual product problem. Make sure you calculate for packaging. Standard packaging is very rarely sufficient. Usually it only costs between 3 and 10 cents more to improve. We've seen some larger products take more like 50 to 70 cents to improve the packaging. And then large palletized items, of course, you want to have the best possible packaging so that you don't have returns on that, very expensive. Even then, though, you're looking at $3 to $5 more for packaging. It's absolutely reasonable to prevent a return. And then for compliance, a lot of people do not calculate in compliance. In the US, there's some pretty strict regulatory requirements around food contact items or other items regulated by the FDA. Very strict requirements for anything with children, so people 13 years or under. The exact letter of the law says 12 years or under, but the law refers to an ASTM standard that is 13 or under, so I always recommend 13 and under. And the other areas that are of concern, cosmetics, topical creams, anything that might be regulated by the EPA for chemicals that weren't in commerce, any supplements. Supplements are a big deal, especially if you make any claims. So understand your compliance requirements, understand what Amazon is requiring from you with restricted or prohibited products. If you are using a prohibited ingredient, there goes your entire investment. So make sure you've done the due diligence upfront, and it's really about risk mitigation. You know, that you can't predict everything, but you can at least do the research to remove as many of the risks involved as possible. Okay, next. So what does regulatory compliance look like for the US? So the number one issue that I see that people are not following, especially Amazon sellers, is making sure that your product is compliant with the CPSIA regulation that passed in 2008 and went into effect from 2009 to 2013. The U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission enforces the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act. And the CPSC is responsible for pretty much all consumer goods in the U.S. that aren't regulated by another agency, which includes all general children's products. What we see happening is people buying stuff that is junior size or in some way indirectly for children, and they're not thinking about the fact that they need to make sure that the product is tested and certified. And then CPSC asks them for information upon import, not always, but a lot of times. And when they do this, they don't have testing, they don't have a certificate. In some cases, the product passes, and so with one client, we were able to just relabel. It was $1.30 a unit to relabel to make sure they had a tracking label. With another client who came to us subsequently, so both of these came to us subsequently when they had the issue with the tracking label. The other one, it was long in their past, and they knew that it was important, so they came to us with their next stuff. They actually had a situation where their product, there was a handle, it was a sporting goods product, and then the handle, the adhesive on the handle failed for lead, and the entire container had to be destroyed. So make sure you understand what the expectations are for CPSC for children's products. They have a nice little robot now on their website where you can go on there and input information, and they'll give you some feedback. Just make sure that you understand that's just for CPSC. That doesn't include regulations for any other agency, just for the ones that they run. So FDA is the Food and Drug Administration. The Food and Drug Administration regulates anything that is in contact with food or could be seen as a drug. So something that is a cosmetic or a topical cream that makes health claims, and they regulate. If it doesn't make health claims, or it's a supplement that doesn't make health claims, they don't regulate it. So the area that's kind of a gray area is make sure you're careful of those health claims and make sure you're careful of the ingredients. Certain ingredients are not considered supplement ingredients, even if you call it a supplement. Anything that could be considered an indirect additive to food is regulated by the FDA. Indirect additives are plates, forks, knives, spoons, garlic presses, silicone baking mats. Anything that actually comes in contact with the food can be considered an indirect food additive because the chemicals will touch each other, and then you can have cross-contamination. So if you have, say, a product that is being cooked in a particular vessel that you created as a seller, and you never validated that that product was food grade, like food grade silicone, or if it was actually a proper, generally recognized as safe or GRAS stainless steel, you could end up accidentally poisoning your customer. And obviously that's a pretty negative customer experience. So make sure you know what's going on there with the FDA regulatory requirements. There are a bunch of other government organizations that are of concern for Amazon sellers. FCC regulates any communications in the U.S., so that's anything with a wireless device or an intentional omission. FTC regulates all labeling claims, so if it's made in the USA or textile labeling, fur labeling, always double check. If somebody says faux fur, double check. It's almost not, in many cases, it's not faux fur. It's like coyote fur, raccoon fur. So double check fur labeling. They also regulate all fine jewelry labeling. Coast Guard regulates anything in use for boats or something for use in the water. In fact, the very largest recall that I ever handled at Amazon was actually the Garmin Blue Ocean recall because the GPS device was like 10 meters off, and so people kept running into things. So that was the problem. Fish and Wildlife regulates anything that comes from Fish and Wildlife, which sounds obvious until you realize it covers anything with mother of pearl. So if you're trying to import, say, a watch with mother of pearl, then you may be required to file documentation for Fish and Wildlife safety. USDA is anything that's food and agriculture. NHTSA is anything in a car. So car replacement parts, car seats, anything that's intended for use in a car is regulated by NHTSA. DOE governs all energy efficiency requirements. So if you're doing any sort of small electronic appliances or light bulbs or anything that uses electrical wattage, there may be energy requirements there. EPA regulates all chemicals in the U.S., and EPA is very painful to work with because they can only regulate about half the chemicals in the U.S. at best, based on how the laws are written. So some things are regulated, some things aren't, some things need to be registered, some things don't. It's very painful. EPA is really only required for people who are selling pesticides or the chemical products, but also anything that has chemical formulations in it. So that's a concern for anyone doing cosmetics or topical cream. The ATF, that is really the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. That really is a concern for people who are selling imitation. So Amazon has very strict requirements for restricted products around weapons. DEA, same thing for certain items are considered restricted substances for the purpose of Amazon because you need to request certain information like driver's licenses or licenses to sell, whereas it's normally perfectly safe to sell, but it's not safe on Amazon to sell because they don't ask for that information on the checkout. OSHA is responsible for workplace safety, so if you have personal protective equipment like steel-toed boots, there are certain requirements that needs to meet so that it can be used in the workplace. The FAA regulates anything that's in transit, FAA and DOT. FAA is anything in transit in the air, DOT is anything in transit on the ground. That's especially important for sellers who are selling hazmat. So understand how your hazmat needs to be labeled, how it needs to be packaged, and how it's supposed to be stored. Okay, next. For quality control, always do inspections, especially if you're small. It's very easy for the factory to be a little bit less careful with your shipment. Always follow up. It's not as though anyone's trying to harm you. They're not doing bad things necessarily. It's just that they don't have the same expectation of quality that your Amazon customer does. And most retail companies don't have the same expectation of quality that Amazon customers do. So standard in the industry is 2.5 and 4.0. Your factory will try to meet that. But what our expectation is that you actually use an AQL of 0.65 and 1.0 because that AQL, which is called an acceptable quality limit, actually can result in defects of 6 to 12%. So that smudges, scratches, different coloration if you have different dialogues in the front and back of an item. Amazon customers notice and complain, and then product quality gets mad at you. So always be very careful of what you're sending into Amazon. Okay, next. Quality assurance refers to laboratory testing. For the U.S., there is no real requirement to have anything safety listed unless it's explicitly for use in the workplace, in which case OSHA oversees that requirement. For anything else, though, like a coffee maker or a tea kettle or whatever, you see a lot of people who are advertising UL or ETL marks or other kinds of marks. All that really means is that the product should fail safely, as in when it does have an electrical surge or it gets old, that it will break itself so that it doesn't light on fire. So safety testing is really making sure that your product, whatever it is, will not light somebody's house on fire. Hoverboards are a great example of this. The Amazon product safety team will step in if they think that your product will light somebody on fire. There's a whole bunch of different keywords that they use to decide what they investigate and what ASINs they take down. And it's things like fire, burn, strangle, choke, all the usual suspects for horrible things happening. Safety is not a regulatory requirement. So your product can be completely compliant from a regulatory perspective and have all the right paperwork and still hurt somebody. So working with someone who understands human behavior, there's actually consultants in human behavior to predict what humans will do. But anyone who's been working in compliance for a long time can tell you humans are not the most logical beings and do a lot of stupid stuff. So it's actually a part of the CPSC's charter that companies should be predicting foreseeable misuse. They may not be able to predict unforeseeable misuse, as in doing really stupid things with their stuff, but at the very least, you should be able to predict what an average person might do with your product. So one example is we had an import of a large-sized tricycle. So it would be like for a child 5 to 7 years old. And the handles had these metal pieces that would come down and scrape the ground, and so it would spark. And the idea was that you could go super fast and you would have cool sparks. And I, of course, thought this was a terrible idea because children and sparks not a good idea. My manager at the time was like, oh, no, like teenage boys would love this, because what you do is you put gasoline on the ground and then you ride super fast and light the gasoline on fire. I'm like, are you kidding me? And he actually went on YouTube and found people already doing this with this product. And so we were like, okay, that is clearly foreseeable misuse. It's already on YouTube. We're not importing this product and making ourselves legally liable for it. And then for quality, there's multiple trade associations out there, and because you have large groups trying to agree on what the standard is, it's usually the lowest common denominator. Depending on your brand's position, it may be required that you do something a little bit more strict than that quality level, since that's basically the bare minimum that you should meet for your product. Okay, next. So what this really does on Amazon is impacts you if you have high returns. You do not want unhappy customers. They leave A to Z claims, they leave negative feedback. That can get you suspended and reviewed on Amazon. With ODR going above 1%, you can get your you can get your payouts on rolling reserve. That can be painful for your cash flow. Poor packaging, I've talked about this a lot. Packaging is kind of a dead horse that I beat on a regular basis, and it's really about making sure that you don't have used sold as new warnings. That's really what it comes down to. Good packaging is super important for customer experience and perception. Non-branded packaging tends to have the unintended consequence of making customers believe your product isn't authentic, that it's cheap Chinese knockoff crap, and then they complain. And obviously those are the ones where you get inquiries because Amazon knows it's not fake, it's your brand, it's a private label product, but they're still going to inquire and take it down because they want you to have more control and more good quality of your product, because Amazon is all about customer experience. If you tick off a customer, then Amazon's not happy about that. And then IP infringement and safety issues. So this is another way that sellers can actually take down other sellers, is by claiming IP infringement and having the documentation to back it up. So make sure you're not infringing anyone else's IP. You can also protect your IP by complaining, but it has to be done in the right way with the right documentation. And then safety issues. If you happen to buy a competitor's product and send it into a lab just to double check, say you're doing everything right and you know that the testing is expensive and probably other people aren't, you can actually send your product into a lab, the other person's product into a lab, and if it fails, you can submit that to Amazon and they'll take the product down. Like, no joke, you can actually do this. So I find a lot of people get frustrated and say, but other people are not doing it, why should I have to do it? Well, first, because it's legally required. Second, because you could hurt somebody. But third, you can actually tell Amazon about the other sellers that aren't meeting those requirements, and they often will take action if you have the right documentation. Okay, next. So what we do is we will contract for you with reputable third-party accredited labs. We do not recommend any inspection services less than $200. Those usually are for companies that can't afford to pay their inspectors sufficiently or don't keep their inspectors busy enough. And so those inspectors are susceptible to bribery, either through the factory bribing them to pass the inspection or the inspector actually blackmailing the factory, both of which happen on a regular basis. So that's a 309 flat rate, except in like inland China where someone has to fly in, and obviously that's more expensive. And the rates are higher if you're sourcing in the US or Europe. For consulting services, we support in consulting for the entire process, beginning to end, whether sourcing, testing, packaging design, optimization on Amazon. We're a very focused company on branded products on Amazon, since most of us came from Amazon Basics and all of us came from Amazon. We're really focused on helping people succeed on Amazon and helping people succeed the right way. So how do you actually build a sustainable brand that can last for the next however many years, as opposed to thinking about, okay, how many months can I make some money off of this before I've got a contract with a new product supplier and bring in another polybagged item that's cheap and crappy. So that's what we do, and our website is www.thinkcascadia.com. And if you sign up for our newsletter, then we send out regular monthly updates that have all of our blog posts in one place and some tips and tricks, information that we have that may be helpful for you. So please feel free to go to our website and contact us. And thanks for listening. I know it's a lot of content.
Yes, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. And just so everyone knows, there will be a replay of this webinar as well as yesterday's webinar sent out tomorrow. So if you feel like you missed something, don't worry, you can watch it and take notes and add your notes to it and whatnot. So right now we're going to move into some questions and answers. I know we have about 12 minutes till we hit the hour mark. So we're just going to dive right in. So the first question, and this goes for either of you, is from Francois. And they ask, what are the main aspects to focus on when expanding to the U.S.?
Okay.
Why don't you go ahead and take the first part of that? And
Yeah,
I can
okay.
take the regulatory side.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you want to think about is obviously making sure that your product is one that can be sold in the U.S., making sure you've got your logistics in place. And by that I mean if you're going to, import, that's set up. If you're going to, maybe be buying stuff and having it sent to or prep and pack center, and then to Amazon if you're doing FBA. But basically, you want to get all your ducks in a row before you go. And most importantly, you want to make sure you can actually sell the products that you want to sell, which is a lot of what Rachel's just been talking about. And then I would suggest one of the best things you can do is read that horrible long contract they want you to sign, because most people don't read it. There's a lot of information in there about things that are allowed and not allowed. And if you just kind of gloss over that contract or think it's the same as the one you already signed in your country, then you will be mistaken and you will make mistakes.
Yeah, I completely agree about the terms of service and actually reading them. So just so you know, everyone who is importing and selling on Amazon, you're indemnifying Amazon for all legal liability of your product. Amazon will not protect you, they will not support you. And we got questions about seller products from regulatory agencies. We provided all of the seller information and said, have fun with that, because we were in no way legally responsible for that product. And so you are fully legally responsible for it. And in the language there, it says that sellers agree to provide safe and compliant product for sale on the Amazon platform. They aren't going to tell you how. They aren't going to give you information about it. But if it's unsafe, they will certainly take it down and punish you for it. So it's really important to note that in the contract that you're signing, you promise to sell safe and legally compliant product. That's a part that I think a lot of people just, it's like a one-line thing, and it's a pretty important one-line.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, our next question is from Alexandros, and it's a two-part question, and this is for either of you. Add to the question if you can. The first part is, how can I calculate U.S. sales tax? And the second part is, when is U.S. sales taxes due?
Okay, so U.S. sales tax, Amazon tries to make that easy for us by, for a small percentage, I think it's like 2%, something like that, they will collect sales tax for you. So if you have registered to pay sales tax in various different states, then they will collect it for you. You are still on your own to actually file and pay it. Sales tax is a pain. And I suggest that if you're going to do it, which I'm sure you are, you'll want to use a program like TaxJar to help actually calculate it out, because the spreadsheet that Amazon gives you is heinous. It is the ugliest thing you've ever seen, and it's very hard to read. And so what TaxJar does is it takes that spreadsheet, that horrible spreadsheet, and it just gives you the answer, basically. And so for each state, because they each have their own filing requirements, it will tell you what you need to know. So there is a software solution for that, I guess is what I'm saying. In terms of which states you actually want to pay sales tax in, that is really a question that you should talk to a CPA who is a sales tax expert, because most CPAs, PS, are not sales tax experts. So you want one who is, because it is very complicated. Each state is different, and the calculation of when you should start to pay really varies by a lot of factors, including your volume. So, and also, the rules are different for foreign-based countries than they are for U.S. countries. So that's where I was going to say, you need to get an expert on board for that, because it's just not something that either Rachel or I could answer fully.
Sure.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it's a risk decision as well for a lot of sellers. If you're really small, the likelihood of anyone coming after you and asking for something is pretty low. But as with many things, the bigger you get, the more important it is to make sure you're doing things right.
Perfect. That's some great advice. Okay, this question is directed to Rachel, and it's from Wolfgang, and he asks, what do I need to take care of when starting to sell from Germany to the US using FBA?
So there's a few elements that I didn't get into about prep and managing your labeling in the US. So one area that is important to make sure of is that if you're shipping anything into Amazon, they do require the suffocation label. And a lot of suffocation labels are mostly compliant. Some of them are fully compliant. If you have a really big product, you need a much larger suffocation warning label. If it's a standard size product in the 10-point size font is fine, but there actually font size is required for the size of the plastic bag as well. So a large product should have a larger label. In general, I would say that if you're doing FBA in the US and you're shipping in from overseas and you don't live here, the first thing you need to do is find a prep company that can help you with labeling for Amazon. You can have your supplier do it, but that's a little bit more difficult. The other thing is that if you're a little bit more paranoid like me, you may not want to provide your FNSKU to the supplier directly. If you don't trust them fully, then you may find yourself a hijacker who has your FNSKU. So that is, the more paranoid side of me coming out. So have a prep approach. Either have it done domestically if you really trust the person that you're working with, the factory you're working with, or have a prep company, or both, just to double check that nothing got smashed up during transit. Depends again on your paranoia level. And then make sure that everything is appropriately packed up to where it can be received at FBA properly. If there's any issues, they tend to just sideline the thing and then it gets lost. It's cheaper for them to sideline it than it is to expend the effort to fix whatever problem there was, and so there goes your inventory. They usually reimburse you for it, but that doesn't help you with growing your brand. And they may reimburse you for it based on an odd calculation that gets you less money than you would otherwise expect to get. And then the other thing is you need a way of handling your returns, so unfulfillable returns or any returns where you need to recall them to a center and have them reviewed, like if there's a product quality issue. So any prep company you work with may be able to do this for you. There's actual returns companies that do this, just this specific thing. But making sure that you have your logistics in place in the US is pretty important. So get a broker, get a prep company, And the last thing is make sure you've got local customer service. If you don't have confidence in your English skills, make sure you have good blurbs. One of the things that is pretty funny but also kind of annoying for customers is non-native English speakers trying to be professional and then using, the wrong word or let's say a malapropism. So it's a word that is correct, but in that context is very odd and weird. And so the easiest thing to do, especially if you started to get bigger and you've got some money, is to outsource your customer service and make sure that you've got blurbs, so pre-written responses, and make sure that they solve the problems that your customers typically have. And every category is different, every product is different, what kind of issues typically come up for your customers.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel. Okay, so this next question is for either of you, and it comes from Gar, and he asks, which market is best to expand to US or Japan for a hair product manufacturer?
I can take the general Japan question. So in general, Japan is pretty difficult to get into for anyone who isn't Japanese or isn't very familiar with Japanese culture. So as far as hair extension, hair products, depending on the local regulations, there may be specific requirements for labeling. So there's certain areas where for human hair you have to follow certain instructions and labels for where it was sourced and how it was sourced. For Japan in general, I honestly, if I'm advising sellers, I don't even bother to recommend Japan, just because it's such a small market in comparison with the US and Europe and even China, and it's just so difficult. There's a lot of difficulties with communicating in Japan and solving a lot of the logistical problems that come in. They have really specific requirements about liquids and labeling and things that you wouldn't understand, like the compliance aspect of it is all honor system, and everyone follows it in Japan. They're all really good at looking at the rules and following them. It was actually one of the more difficult aspects of working with Japan as an internal employee, because you try to roll it out an SOP, and if it wasn't all completely laid out and completely clear, they wouldn't adopt it. So Japan in general, I'm not a big fan of going into it as an Amazon seller unless you're a really big company and you have a partner to help you do it.
Okay. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that at all, Cynthia?
Well, I was just going to say, from a product point of view, it's a great market for hair and skincare. But again, you have to make sure your product is really good, and that, as Rachel said, that you have it properly labeled. It's going to be work. You're going to have a different product being shipped to Japan than you might ship anywhere else, basically. But as many health and beauty companies in the U.S. have discovered, Japan is a wonderful market for selling their products. And so I can see why that question was asked. But definitely from ease of getting into it and size of the market, the U.S. market's going to be bigger, but it's also more competitive as well. So I have a friend, fellow seller, who is a large seller of like shampoos and beauty products, and he's very buttoned up. He's private label, and he does a really good job and makes money doing it on Amazon. I think that you definitely need to pick a country at a time and really learn all of their rules before you go to another one. That's one thing I would say, is you wouldn't want to do Japan and the U.S. at the same time, for example.
Okay, perfect. I think we're right at the hour, but I think we have time for just one more question. And this is a pretty good one for either of you. And this one comes from Norbert, and he asks, how do we import products into the U.S. without an EIN? And follow-up says, if we don't have an EIN, can we use Amazon's EIN if we send the product straight to FBA from China?
No, never ever use Amazon's EIN.
All right, just clarifying for
Sorry, I used to sit across the aisle from the trade compliance guys, and they would complain every day about sellers doing that. They hate it. They actually set up a whole process to reject shipments where Amazon's EIN was used. They have published multiple notices in Seller Central saying don't use Amazon's EIN. They get really grumpy about that, so don't do that. The best way to do it is as a non-resident importer, and this is not my area of expertise, this is Jennifer's. But as a non-resident importer, you can do it as a sole proprietor, and you can do it as a company. And we work with Shapiro to do our brokerage for our clients. And it's certainly possible to do without an EIN, but my understanding is that it's just different forms that you have to fill out as a non-resident importer. But again, it's not my area of expertise, but just don't use Amazon. I can just hear them complaining in my head right now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, great. That's some sound advice. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, well, that makes us over the hour. Thank you for everyone who attended. Again, we will have a replay as well as the slides going out tomorrow to everyone who registered and attended, and we will also include links to Rachel's website as well as Cynthia. Thank you so much.
Bye.